1907. Late August. Upper Amazon Basin. By every known rule of exploration, what happened next should not have happened at all. A launch slipped its moorings at dawn and turned away from the main river, nose angling into a tributary the color of ink. The charts thinned there. The sound of the current changed. The air grew heavy in a way men feel before they can explain it. The expedition counted 8 Europeans, 3 hired paddlers, and 1 guide who refused to give his full name. Against them stood a forest older than any map, deeper than any doctrine of survival, and, if the reports were true, inhabited by something that did not fit the scale of men. History insists this should have ended at the mouth of that tributary. The year matters. 1907 was not a time of innocence in the Amazon. Rubber had already taught men how cheaply life could be spent. Fever was a given. Disappearances were common enough to be recorded as weather. Yet even by those standards, the decision to push into black water defied logic. No rational commander would attempt it with the supplies they carried, the numbers they had, and the knowledge already circulating in the ports downstream. They went anyway. The mission on paper was clinical. Survey tributaries, record settlements, return with samples and notes. The unspoken purpose, understood by every man aboard, was verification. Reports had reached Balem and Manaus of a village upriver that consumed its enemies, its dead, and sometimes its guests. That alone would not have moved money. What moved money were the measurements. Doorframes too tall, cooking pits too deep, footprints pressed into mud where the stride exceeded any known gait. Giants. No one said the word aloud during the first hours. Men rarely do when they fear sounding foolish. Instead, they spoke of currents and banks, of insects and humidity, of the weight of crates shifting as the launch cut its engine and the paddlers took over. The guide sat forward, watching the water. He did not sing. He did not tell stories. When asked how far the next camp might be, he answered with distances measured in time, not miles. By mid-morning, the forest closed in. The river narrowed, and the canopy knit itself overhead until daylight fell in strips. The sound of the paddles echoed wrong, swallowed too quickly. Birds thinned out. The monkeys went quiet. The men noticed without comment. In war, the absence of sound is never neutral. It means something is listening. They made first landfall at a bend where the bank rose just enough to keep canvas dry. The decision was sound by the book. High ground. Clear lines to the water. A place to establish routine. Routine is what keeps men alive when reason begins to slip. They unloaded. Crates. Instruments. Rifles wrapped in oilcloth. Salt. More salt than necessary for preservation alone. The guide watched the salt longer than the weapons. When asked why, he said nothing. He only nodded once, as if a test had been passed. By afternoon, the heat pressed down like a hand. Sweat-soaked collars. Insects found the gaps in sleeves. The doctor, older than the others, slower, careful, ordered netting and discipline. Do not scratch. Do not drink from the river. Boil everything. He spoke as if order could be imposed by tone. History offers little evidence that the jungle listens. The first sign arrived without ceremony. A paddler, Nilo, broad-backed and quiet, set down his load and stared at the mud near the waterline. He did not call out. He did not kneel. He simply stood there, hands open, as if counting. When the others gathered, they saw it. A footprint pressed deep, toes spread wide, heels sunk far lower than a man's weight should allow. The length exceeded any boot in camp. The stride, measured roughly, suggested a gait that would have carried its owner through undergrowth without breaking pace. By every known rule of biology, it was impossible. The leader ordered no sketches, no measurements. Not yet. He covered the print with loose earth using the flat of a shovel and told the men to finish camp. Overreaction, he said, is how panic spreads. Panic is how expeditions die. He was right in theory. In practice, the forest does not respect theory. At dusk, the temperature dropped. The black water took on a sheen like oil. Fires were kept low. Watches were assigned despite protest. The guide objected once, quietly, then fell silent. He took the last watch without being asked. During the night, something moved beyond the ring of light. It was not the crash of a large animal. It was the deliberate sound of branches eased aside, of weight shifted carefully. A presence testing the perimeter. The men on watch felt it before they saw anything, an instinct older than doctrine. Rifles were lifted, then lowered. Nothing crossed into firelight. Nothing needed to. Morning revealed marks on the far side of the clearing. Saplings bent, not snapped. Bark scraped high above a man's reach. The doctor measured with his eyes and said nothing. The leader ordered breakfast, ordered notes taken, ordered the canoes readied. Momentum, he believed, would outrun fear. By mid-morning, they pushed on. The tributary split into channels that twisted back. 1907. Third day beyond the bend. By every known rule of first contact, what happened next should have triggered immediate retreat. The horn did not sound again. Silence replaced it, dense, deliberate, total. In warfare, silence after a signal is never absence. It is coordination. The leader ordered the canoes pushed off at once, but the water betrayed them. The black channel here was narrow, choked with roots and fallen timber, and the paddlers hesitated, eyes fixed on the tree line. Fear spreads fastest through hesitation. One man froze, another crossed himself. The guide spoke sharply, a single word that meant now, not later, not afterthought. They shoved off as something shifted on the far bank. The first figure emerged where the trees thinned. It did not rush. It did not posture. It stepped forward with the patience of something that knows it is already seen. It was tall, taller than any man present, its shoulders broad enough to change the geometry of the clearing. The skin was darkened with ash or pigment, marked with scars that ran not randomly but in parallel lines, old and deliberate. In its hand was a club cut from hardwood, weighted at one end, polished smooth by use. By every known rule of anthropology, this should have been myth. A second figure appeared behind the first, then a third. They did not speak. They did not shout. They spread laterally, spacing themselves as infantry would, denying angles, controlling ground. No rational commander would expect tactical discipline from an unrecorded village. History insists discipline requires doctrine. The forest does not agree. A rifle cracked. It was not an order. It was Baltasar, the armorer, reacting to motion he could not place. The shot tore bark from a tree near the lead figure's shoulder. The figure did not flinch. It turned its head slowly, as if registering sound rather than threat. The second figure raised its club, not to strike, but to signal. The response was immediate. From the undergrowth on both sides of the clearing, shapes rose. Not rushed, not chaotic, countable. Too many to count quickly. The expedition's numerical advantage, never great, collapsed into nothing. By every known rule of engagement, this was encirclement. The leader shouted to cease fire. He raised his hands, palms out, a universal gesture taught in no manual but understood by those who have survived long enough to need it. He spoke in Portuguese first, then Spanish, then the few ritual phrases of trade languages he knew. The words fell flat, absorbed by the trees. The figures did not advance. They waited. The guide stepped forward without being told. He placed his machete on the ground and pushed it toward the clearing with his foot. Then he removed the salt from his pack, wrapped carefully, protected from moisture, and held it out at arm's length. He did not bow. He did not plead. He stood still, spine straight, offering value. The tallest figure approached him. Up close, scale became undeniable. The man, if that word still applied, stood a head and shoulders above the guide. His chest bore old burns, healed cleanly. His eyes were level, assessing, not curious. He took the salt, sniffed it once, then passed it back to one of the others without comment. He leaned down, not crouching, not bending submissively, and examined the guide's face. For a moment no one breathed. Then the giant spoke. It was not a shout. It was not a chant. It was a low, controlled sound, syllables clipped, delivered with the economy of command. The guide answered in a tongue none of the others recognized. Short phrases, careful pauses. The exchange lasted less than a minute. When it ended, the giant straightened and gestured. Not toward the canoes, but deeper into the forest. The meaning was clear. Follow. No rational commander would comply. Compliance ceded initiative, surrendered terrain, and invited annihilation. The leader hesitated long enough for the encircling figures to shift their weight. Clubs were not raised. They did not need to be. The message was physical, movement was expected. The decision was made in the space between heartbeats. They followed. The path was not a path in the European sense. It was a corridor of absence. Undergrowth thinned, branches cut high, ground packed hard by repeated passage. The giants moved through it without breaking stride. The expedition struggled to keep pace. Packs catching, boots slipping in mud that seemed to pull at the feet. Sweat turned cold. The doctor fell once and was hauled up by his collar, not roughly, not gently, efficiently. As they moved, the forest changed. The air carried smoke. The ground bore ash. Poles rose ahead, tall, carved, driven deep. Symbols cut into them repeated at intervals, variations on a theme. Circles bisected by lines, marks that suggested counting or ownership. Territory. They reached the village at dusk. It was larger than reported, larger than feared. Huts built high, roofs sloped steeply, doorways scaled to bodies that did not need to duck. Fires burned in pits dug deep, ringed with stone. Racks of meat smoked steadily, the cuts thick, the bones unmistakable. Children watched from the edges, silent, eyes tracking movement with unnerving focus. Women, if that word applied, moved between fires with practiced ease, carrying loads that would have required 2 men elsewhere. The expedition was brought to the center. The tallest figure, the leader, now unmistakable, took a seat carved from a single trunk. Others arranged themselves around him, not randomly, but in a pattern that spoke of rank. The guide was placed forward. The rest were ordered to kneel, hands visible, weapons untouched where they had been stacked at the edge of the clearing. The leader of the expedition began to speak. He did not beg. He did not threaten. He stated purpose, route, intent to leave. He spoke as a man used to being heard. The giant listened without expression. When the speech ended, he turned to the guide and spoke at length. The guide's face tightened. He answered slowly, choosing words like a man crossing thin ice. When the exchange ended, the giant gestured. 2 villagers approached and dragged forward a frame made of poles. On it hung objects wrapped in hide. The hides were pulled back. They were boots, a hat, compass case, European. The guide closed his eyes. The giant spoke again, this time pointing at the expedition, then at the smoking racks. The meaning was not subtle. It was not ritual. It was transactional. By every known rule of survival, this was the moment to refuse. The leader did not. He asked a question instead. The guide translated, voice barely steady. The giant's answer was short. He raised one finger, then another, then a third. He pointed upriver. 3 days. 3 days of what was not specified. The fires crackled. The children leaned closer. The racks smoked on, indifferent. Somewhere beyond the huts, something heavy was dragged across packed earth, leaving a sound that scraped along the spine. The expedition had entered the village alive. History insists that is not the same as being allowed to leave. 1907. First night inside the village. By every known rule of captivity, the expedition should have been killed before darkness fell. They were not. That was the first mistake. The giants did not bind them. They did not separate them. They did not shout orders or strike blows to establish dominance. Instead, they were given a space near the central fire, just far enough from the huts to remain visible at all times. Visibility was the restraint. Every movement was watched. Every whisper registered. In war, the absence of chains often means the presence of certainty. Certainty that escape is unnecessary. The leader took stock with the discipline of a man refusing to panic. Numbers, fires, distances. He counted at least 40 adults, more in the shadows. He noted the clubs, the spears leaned against posts, the way the younger men carried themselves, alert but not tense. These were not hunters reacting to prey. They were custodians managing inventory. The doctor understood first. He watched the smoking racks and did not look away. The cuts were human, prepared with care, stripped clean, treated as sustenance, not display. Cannibalism, when it appears in history, is often framed as desperation or ritual. This was neither. This was infrastructure. By every known rule of reason, reason itself began to fail. At the edge of the clearing, a group of elders gathered, larger even than the rest, their skin mapped with scars that suggested survival through violence and age. They spoke among themselves in low tones, occasionally glancing toward the expedition. The guide stood apart, allowed to move but not to leave the fire's radius. When the leader approached him, the guide did not meet his eyes. "They know who you are," the guide said quietly. "Not by name, by type." "What does that mean?" the leader asked. The guide swallowed. "Men who arrive, men who measure, men who return with others. Rubber men, surveyors, traders, slavers by proxy." The forest did not distinguish between them. Food was brought. It was placed deliberately between the expedition and the fire. Roasted roots, smoked fish, water in carved vessels. The message was unmistakable. Eat, live, refuse, and choose differently. The leader nodded once and took a portion. One by one, the others followed. Even Baltasar ate, jaw tight, eyes never leaving the racks. During the meal, a child approached. He could not have been more than 10 years old, already tall for his age, limbs corded with muscle. He stood in front of Tomas, the youngest of the expedition, the one who had volunteered too quickly, eager to prove himself. The child tilted his head and studied Tomas's face with open curiosity. Then he reached out and touched Tomas's hair, running his fingers through it as one might test the quality of rope. Tomas did not move. The child smiled, not cruelly, not kindly, praising. He was called back with a word and obeyed at once. Night deepened. Fires were banked but not extinguished. The sounds of the forest pressed in, but within the village there was order. Watch rotations changed. Tools were stored. Life continued. That continuity was more frightening than chaos. Chaos can be exploited. Routine cannot. Near midnight, the giant leader returned to the center. He spoke and the village stilled. He gestured for the guide to translate. The terms were simple. 3 days. 3 days the expedition would remain. During that time they would be observed, evaluated. The giants would decide what they were worth, not as men but as resources. Knowledge, trade, meat, or something else. By every known rule of survival, this was a death sentence postponed, not revoked. The leader asked what would determine the decision. The guide translated. The answer came back without hesitation. Strength, utility, compliance. And after 3 days? The leader pressed. The giant's response was a shrug that carried the weight of inevitability. Some would leave. Some would not. Which ones depended on how useful they proved themselves to be. The doctor exhaled slowly. "They're not lying," he said under his breath. "Liars explain themselves. They don't need to." Sleep was permitted but shallow. The men lay with backs to the fire, faces toward the dark, instincts screaming at them to watch what could not be watched. Dreams came in fragments. Meat, smoke, weight pressing down. At dawn, the work began. The giants did not order them to labor. They demonstrated tasks and waited to see who stepped forward. Carrying loads, cutting timber, repairing racks. The message was clear. Initiative would be noticed. So would weakness. Baltasar volunteered first, lifting a bundle that should have required 2 men. He strained, muscles screaming, but he did not drop it. The giants watched without comment. Tomas followed, then Nilo, then the leader himself. The doctor worked with herbs and salves when a child cut his hand, moving with calm authority. That too was observed. By midday, sweat soaked every man. Hands blistered, backs bent. The giants did not hurry them. Time was not scarce here. Bodies were. During a pause, the guide was called aside again. This time, the conversation lasted longer. When he returned, his face had gone pale beneath the grime. "They want to see how you die," he said to the leader. "If it comes to that." The leader did not ask how. In the afternoon, a commotion rippled through the village. Two giants dragged something into the clearing. A man, European, thin, scarred, alive but barely. His eyes rolled, unfocused. His leg was bound poorly, the wound beneath swollen and black. Recognition hit like a blow. He was from another expedition, one reported missing months earlier. Proof that survival beyond first contact was possible. Proof that it did not last. The man was dropped near the fire. The elders gathered. The giant leader spoke. The guide translated with visible effort. This man had failed. He had been kept, used, worked until he could not stand. Now he was no longer efficient. The giants waited. No rational commander would intervene. Intervention would mark the expedition as hostile, irrational, emotional. It would collapse any remaining margin. The leader hesitated. Tomas did not. He stepped forward without thinking, kneeling beside the injured man, offering water, murmuring in a language the man barely recognized. The giants tensed, not in alarm but in interest. The leader opened his mouth to call Tomas back. Too late. The giant leader rose from his seat and approached. He looked down at Tomas, then at the wounded man. He said a single word. The guide's voice shook as he translated. Choose. Choose mercy and defiance, or compliance and survival. By every known rule of logic, there was only one answer. Tomas looked up, eyes wide, and shook his head. No, he said. I won't. The giant leader nodded once. He raised his club. The leader shouted. Baltasar moved. The paddlers cried out. The club fell anyway, with precision, with finality. The sound was not loud. It did not need to be. Blood darkened the earth. Children watched. The wounded man did not scream. He did not have the strength. The giant leader turned back to his seat. The guide sank to his knees. The message had been delivered. 3 days had begun. And one of them had already been marked. 1907. Second day inside the village. By every known rule of captivity, someone should have broken by now. No one did. Not outwardly. Tomas was gone before dawn. Not dragged. Not carried. Simply absent, as if he had never been counted among them at all. The ground where he had knelt was clean, swept, ash spread thin. In the Amazon, disappearance is not an event. It is a method. The expedition woke stiff, hollow-eyed, and already changed. The night had done its work. Fear had settled into something colder, calculation. In war, men survive not by bravery, but by learning how little of themselves they can afford to lose. The work resumed without orders. That was the first lesson of the second day. Obedience was assumed. Those who waited to be told what to do were watched more closely than those who acted. The giants did not shout commands. They let the silence do it for them. Baltasar was set to repair weapons, clubs split by use, spearheads loosened from shafts. He worked with care, fingers steady despite the weight of what had happened. The giants gathered around him, observing the way he tested balance, the way he selected grain in wood. One of them handed him a massive club, cracked near the handle. Baltasar ran his thumb along the fracture and nodded. He could fix it. That mattered. The doctor was taken to a hut at the edge of the village where the sick were kept. Fever was present here, too. Infection did not respect size. He treated abscesses, set a child's broken arm, lanced a wound that smelled of rot. He worked without hesitation, without sermon. The giants watched his hands, not his face. When a patient improved, they did not thank him. They simply noted it. Utility was currency. The leader was tested differently. He was brought before the elders and asked, through the guide, to explain the world beyond the forest. Not stories, structures. How many men followed orders in the cities? How goods moved? How violence was organized? He spoke carefully, aware that every word might translate into future raids, future deaths. He omitted numbers. He blurred distances. He described the river as more dangerous than it was, the cities as less rich. The giants listened with interest, not awe. They already knew enough. At midday, the true purpose of the second day revealed itself. A clearing beyond the huts had been prepared. The ground was tamped flat. Poles marked distances. The giant leader gestured, and 2 of his warriors stepped forward. They were enormous even by the village's standards. Bodies thick with muscle, scars layered over scars. Each carried a club. The guide's voice was barely audible. "They want to see how you fight." By every known rule of survival, this was where negotiation ended. The leader protested. The giants ignored him. The guide was silenced with a glance. The warriors took positions across from each other. This was not execution. It was demonstration. Power measured against power. The first blow landed with a sound like wood splitting wet meat. The second followed before the first man could fall. The fight was over in seconds. One warrior lay still. The other stood, breathing hard, blood running down his chest. The giants were unimpressed. They turned their attention to the expedition. One of them pointed at Baltasar. The armorer did not hesitate. He stepped forward, removing his jacket, rolling his shoulders. He had killed men before, on borders, in jungles, in places where law thinned out. But he had never faced something like this. He picked up a smaller club offered to him, testing its weight. The giant he faced was almost twice his mass. The leader shouted. The doctor shook his head. Baltasar glanced back once, a flicker of something like apology in his eyes. Then he squared his stance. By every known rule of combat, the outcome was predetermined. The giant moved first, swinging with deceptive speed. Baltasar ducked, felt wind pass where his head had been. He struck back, aiming not for power but for joints, knees, wrists, the way a man fights when he knows he cannot win on strength. The blow landed. The giant grunted, surprised. Surprise did not last. The return strike lifted Baltasar off his feet and slammed him into the dirt. Bones cracked. Air left his lungs in a sound that was almost a laugh. He rolled, came up, swung again, driven by refusal rather than hope. The club glanced off muscle that might as well have been armor. The giant ended it with a downward blow that crushed shoulder and collarbone together. Silence followed. Baltasar lay alive, but unmoving. The giant leader watched for a long moment, then nodded, not in approval but acknowledgement. Baltasar had fought. That mattered. He gestured, and 2 villagers dragged Baltasar away, not toward the racks, but toward the huts of the wounded. He was not useless. Not yet. The message settled over the expedition like ash. Those who demonstrated value might be spared. Those who did not would be processed accordingly. The rest of the day passed in heavy labor. Carrying stone, digging pits. Work designed not for efficiency, but for exhaustion. Sweat blurred vision. Hands shook. The giants never rushed them. They waited for mistakes. Near dusk, Nilo faltered. The broad-shouldered paddler stumbled under a load, knees buckling. He caught himself, tried to rise, failed. A giant approached, watching with detached interest. Nilo looked up, eyes wide, pleading without words. The giant did not strike him. He lifted the load from Nilo's back and set it aside. Then he took Nilo by the arm and led him away. Not roughly, not gently. Just away. The expedition never saw him again. Night fell. The leader gathered the remaining men close, voices low. There were fewer now. The guide listened, face hollow. "Tomorrow," the guide said, "they decide. Decide who leaves. Decide who stays. Decide who feeds the village." From the darkness beyond the huts came the sound of stone against bone, slow and methodical. Preparation, not hurried, confident. By every known rule of probability, none of them should have survived the third day. History does not care about probability. Cares about what happens next. 1907. Third day. Before dawn. By every known rule of captivity, this was the day men were counted for the last time. The village woke earlier than it had on the previous mornings. Fires were already burning when the expedition stirred. Smoke lay low, trapped beneath the canopy, stinging eyes and throats. It carried a heavier scent now, fat, iron, cooked flesh. No one needed to ask what it was. Baltasar was alive. That alone felt unreal. He lay near the edge of the huts, shoulder bound with splints cut from green wood, chest wrapped tight. His breathing was shallow but steady. When his eyes opened and found the leader, he tried to speak and failed. The doctor knelt beside him, checking pulse, checking fever. He shook his head slightly. Baltasar would not fight again. He might not walk. His value had narrowed to memory and warning. The giants did not interfere. They had already decided what he was worth. At sunrise, the horn sounded again. 3 long notes, evenly spaced. The entire village assembled. Men, women, children, elders. The expedition was brought to the center, arranged deliberately so that there was space between each of them. Separation without force. A reminder that unity was no longer assumed. The giant leader rose. He carried no weapon. That was not mercy. That was confidence. The guide stood beside him, hands shaking now, no longer able to hide it. When the leader spoke, the guide translated in fragments, pausing often, as if each sentence required effort to carry. The assessment was complete. The giants had measured strength, utility, compliance. They had tested skill and observed character. They had learned enough about the world beyond the forest to satisfy immediate curiosity. Now came the transaction. 2 villagers stepped forward and placed objects on the ground. The compass case taken from the dead expedition. A rifle Baltasar's, bent beyond repair. A coil of rope. And salt. All of the salt. The guide swallowed hard. This, he said, is what they will take regardless. Then the giant leader gestured again, and 3 lines were drawn in the dirt with the butt of a spear. 3 categories. The guide did not explain at first. He did not have to. Meaning pressed in on its own. Those who would leave. Those who would stay. Those who would feed the others. By every known rule of negotiation, this was no negotiation at all. The leader spoke carefully, slowly, choosing words meant to preserve dignity. He offered tools, knowledge, future trade. He promised that others would come if they did not return. He promised consequences that might follow violence. The giant listened politely. Then he answered. The guide's voice broke as he translated. He says, "The forest has eaten many promises. It is not full." The first name was given. One of the remaining paddlers, Caesar, the thin youth with the cross, was pulled forward. He cried out, clutching the symbol at his neck. The giant leader regarded it with mild curiosity, then nodded. Caesar was led to the left. To leave. The second name followed. The doctor. A murmur passed through the expedition. The leader protested at once, too quickly. The guide silenced him with a look of raw fear. "They need him," the guide whispered. "Alive." The doctor met the leader's eyes and gave a small nod. He had known this was possible from the first night. Knowledge, once proven useful, is rarely returned. He was led to the right. To stay. Then the giant leader turned his gaze to Baltasar. There was no need to speak his name. 2 giants lifted him carefully, almost respectfully, and carried him toward the racks. Baltasar did not struggle. He looked once at the leader, eyes clear despite the pain, and managed a breathless sound that might have been a laugh. The doctor shouted. The leader moved forward. Clubs shifted. The guide grabbed the leader's arm with both hands. "Don't," he hissed. "This is the price." Baltasar was placed down behind the racks, out of sight. The sounds that followed were muted by distance and smoke. They did not need to be loud. The leader stood rigid, jaw locked, as a man learns to stand when the world demands witness without action. By every known rule of command, this was the moment authority shattered. And yet, paradoxically, this was when leadership mattered most, when it consisted of not moving. The remaining names came quickly. One of the assistants, gone. Another paddler, gone. The guide himself was paused on, the giant leader studying him longer than the others. Words were exchanged, private, low. The guide nodded once, defeated. He would stay. When the dust settled, 3 of the expedition remained unassigned. The leader, the clerk, the one who wrote, who observed, who remembered, and the child who had been spared earlier for his strength. The giant leader rose from his seat and approached them. Up close, the difference in scale was overwhelming. The leader of the expedition had once commanded men in border conflicts, had stared down rifles and riots. None of that mattered here. Power was not abstract in this place. It was embodied. The giant spoke. The guide translated through tears. "These three," he said, "will leave." Relief came too fast. That was how it worked. Hope offered abruptly, before it could be examined. The leader thanked him. He thanked the giant. He promised again what he knew he could not control. The giant listened, then added something else. The guide's shoulders slumped. "They leave," he said, "because they will carry the story." A pause. "And because stories bring others." The implication was clear. This was not mercy. It was strategy. They were marched to the river immediately. No farewells were permitted. The doctor watched from the edge of the village, face expressionless. The guide did not look back. Balthasar was gone. Nilo was gone. Tomas was gone. The village swallowed them all with the same efficiency it used to swallow meat and bone. At the water's edge, a canoe waited, one, not two. Supplies were minimal. No salt, no weapons, just enough to reach the main river if luck held. Before they pushed off, the giant leader stepped into the shallows. He crouched, bringing his face level with the clerk's. His eyes were calm, reflective, unburdened by doubt. He spoke once more. The guide was not there to translate. The meaning did not require it. This was not an ending. This was an opening. The paddles dipped. The canoe slid into the black water. The village receded behind them, swallowed by trees and smoke. Within minutes, it was gone, as if it had never existed. None of them spoke. They did not need to. They carried fewer men than they had brought. They carried more weight. And somewhere behind them, in a place no map would ever properly hold, a village had learned exactly how valuable explorers could be, alive or otherwise. History insists survival means escape. The forest insists survival means return. River returned. 1907. 10 days later. Lower Amazon. By every known rule of survival, no one should have believed them. The canoe emerged from the black water like something expelled rather than delivered. 3 men remained where 11 had entered. They were thinner, quieter. Their eyes tracked shorelines long after danger had passed. When fishermen hailed them from a sandbar, the leader did not answer at first. He waited, listening for sounds that were no longer there, horns, movement too heavy for monkeys, silence that meant coordination. They reached a trading post at dusk. The clerk collapsed the moment his feet touched planks. His hands, once steady enough to record detail without emotion, shook uncontrollably. He would never write the same way again. The leader held himself upright through force of habit alone. Authority, he had learned, did not end when command failed. It ended when memory did. They were fed, washed, questioned, and then disbelieved. Giants were folklore. Cannibal villages were exaggerations used to excuse failed expeditions. Missing men were attributed to fever, mutiny, or incompetence. The official report, what would survive on paper, was softened until it resembled something reasonable. Tomas died of illness. Balthasar succumbed to injuries sustained during labor. Nilo deserted. The doctor remained voluntarily to study local medicine. Lies that fit forms. Truth rarely does. The clerk tried to object. He described scale, organization, discipline, the categories drawn in the dirt, the way the giants evaluated men not as enemies but as assets. He spoke until his throat burned. The administrator closed the ledger and said, "You are exhausted." The leader said nothing, because he understood something the others did not. Denial was not ignorance. It was defense. If the giants were real, then the forest was not merely hostile, it was strategic. And that meant the frontier was not empty. It was occupied. Within weeks, rumors spread anyway. Sailors talked. Rubber men whispered. A missionary mentioned a village where doorways were too tall and bones were cooked without ceremony. A trader claimed to have seen footprints larger than his canoe. Each story grew less precise as it traveled, but more disturbing. No expedition was authorized to verify them. That was the second mistake. The leader resigned his commission quietly. He did not argue. He did not threaten to publish. He returned upriver only once, standing at a bend where black water merged with brown. He watched it for a long time, then turned away. Some battles are not meant to be revisited. They are meant to be remembered accurately and avoided. The clerk wrote privately, not a report, a warning. He described the giants without myth. No magic, no monsters, just men shaped by environment, selection, and violence into something incompatible with intrusion. He emphasized the most important detail, the one officials ignored. The giants did not attack blindly. They assessed. They adapted. They learned. In war, that is the most dangerous enemy of all. The guide was never seen again. Some said he lived out his days among the giants, translating the world beyond the trees into something useful. Others said he was eaten when his value expired. Both explanations fit the evidence. The doctor's herbs began appearing in villages far upriver months later. Wounds healed faster. Fevers were treated with unfamiliar methods. Knowledge had crossed the boundary, so had intent. Years later, when armed patrols finally attempted to push into that tributary, they found nothing. No village, no racks, no poles, just forest altered subtly, intelligently, paths erased, clearings reclaimed, signs removed or repositioned to mislead. The giants had moved. They always would. History prefers endings. Survivors prefer silence. But the forest does not forget transactions. It remembers who entered, what was taken, and what was learned. In 1907, 3 men came back to tell a story that should not have been possible. Not because giants existed, but because they understood something explorers did not. That survival is leverage, that fear is currency, and that sometimes the most effective weapon is letting the enemy leave alive, carrying the message for you. The Amazon did not close behind them. It adjusted, and somewhere beyond the black water, where maps still thin into guesses, men continue to measure footsteps in the mud and tell themselves the same lie men have always told before disaster, that this time will be different.